In 1989, Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird became too busy with the growth of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So busy that they couldn't work on the comic anymore. That's when they decided to invite other writers and artists to tell stories with the Turtles. One of these artists was Rick Veitch, who wrote a few stories for the book. Stories that, at the time of this writing, cannot be reprinted anymore. Join me today as I explore one of these stories known as the River Trilogy, and why it may never be reprinted again. For context, this story was published right after the Return to New York saga, where the Turtles finally put an end to the Shredder and ended their exile. The timing for that story was crucial, as the marketing storm known as Turtlemania was growing bigger and bigger with every new action figure, cartoon episode, comic book, video game, an upcoming movie, and musical. This took the creators away from the comics and threw them into managerial obligations. And as I mentioned earlier, this gave birth to what we now call the Guest Era. The River was one of these stories, and it was written and illustrated by Rick Veitch, with letters by Steve Levine and Gary Fields. But to understand the reasons behind the unprintable status of the saga, we need to go a little back in time to when Rick worked for DC Comics. There, he was given the Swamp Thing book, right after the departure of Alan Moore. The ecological and somewhat esoteric nature of that book is a good expansion on the story I'll be exploring today, and if you're old enough, you should definitely read it. Rick's run ended abruptly when he ran into problems with his editors and what could have been the first work for DC of another TMNT artist, Michael Zulli. The issue had Swamp Thing on a journey through time, and eventually becoming involved with the story of the crucifixion of Christ. While the story was initially okayed, editors feared a boycott they couldn't afford. Rick and Zulli tried to salvage what they could of that story and make it less inflammatory, but in the end they couldn't agree on a rewrite, and the two quit the book. Burned by the experience, Rick went to his friends at Mirage Studios, a then indie company known for its respect for their artists, and he was offered to write stories for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. His first story, which we'll be talking about today, was a horror trilogy that revolved around the mysterious nature of the Connecticut River and the effect of the exploitation of natural resources. As you can imagine, Rick brought the sensitivities of the Swamp Thing into the Turtles book. The story takes place after the Return to New York events, with the Turtles being back in Northampton and still training with Master Splinter. Splinter was trying to train their meditation skills, but unfortunately, the boys were more used to getting into action than connecting with nature and each other. Raphael in particular wasn't finding any value in the practice, and because of this, he was holding his brothers back. Splinter tried to use peer pressure to align the brothers in this goal. He suggested that perhaps they were still too immature for this. This infuriated them and made them conspire to teach Raph a lesson. But when they got to him, they found him admiring some turtle hatchlings on the riverbed. Seeing them so carefree made him wonder what life could have been had they remained pets. But one of these hatchlings wasn't moving. Raph turned it over and found a leech, who he nicknamed Bloodsucker. Seeing how Raphael hated leeches, his brothers forced one onto his foot as payback for his behavior during training. Raph removed the leech but spared its life, returning it to the water. The next day proved to be more challenging for Raphael. Master Splinter, well connected with everything around him, realized his son was very unfocused. But that wasn't all. He also sensed something evil growing nearby. This session was interrupted after Raphael fell unconscious. Guilty about the previous day's prank, the Turtles took Raphael to the river to cool off. While there, they noticed something attacking a snapping turtle. They decided to dive in to help it, and that was when they discovered a strange creature, which they followed into a subterranean cave. In this cave, they realized that the creature was a giant leech. Perhaps trying to prove his maturity, Raphael decided to block the entrance to the cave with his carapace, while his brothers went back for their weapons and Splinter. By the time the Turtles returned, Raphael was barely conscious. The leech was successful at sucking his blood through his shell, and now had arms and legs. After seeing this, Splinter realized this was probably the growing evil he sensed. Unfortunately, before he could figure out what to do with the creature, Leonardo couldn't contain his rage and sliced the leech to pieces. Over the following days, Raphael started devolving, becoming more childlike and innocent, losing muscle and skills until he went back to being an oversized baby turtle. The new reality was hard to ignore. Splinter theorized that whatever kept them as mutants was perhaps running through their blood. The leech probably sucked the ooze out of Raphael's blood, so their only chance at reverting him back to mutant was to find whatever was left of that leech. Unfortunately, there were no traces of the leech anymore, and then they were surprised by a Massachusetts fish and game warden. Once he put his hands on Raphael, they realized he was that same blood-sucking leech, now in humanoid form, totally recovered from Leo's attack. It took them no time to find the corpse of the real warden. Bloodsucker escaped upriver, and with him, the only chance the brothers had to restore Raphael. Leo, Mikey, and Donnie followed Bloodsucker by the river, while April, Casey, and Raphael followed them by car. The trace of Bloodsucker took them to Booter Falls, where the creature attacked 3 young kids. The turtles protected them from Bloodsucker, but after killing a few humans, the creature became even stronger and threatened to make the entire planet his private preserve. On the road, Casey and April also ran into trouble after the local police chief, Chief Manigan, tried to put Casey in jail for irresponsible driving. Casey jumped off the bridge, and the situation got completely out of control when the kids showed up, warning the chief about some giant turtles and leech fighting each other. Manigan decided to put them all in jail, even the kids, and in the commotion, Raphael escaped from the car and went after Casey down the river. Manigan put April and the kids behind bars and called his real boss immediately. The most powerful man in Booter Falls, Samuel Booter VI, the owner of the Booter Corporation. Suspecting the creatures were a product of pollution and proof of their illegal chemical waste dumping, Manigan left them jailed and went to talk to his boss. While this was highly illegal, the boss's uncle was the judge. Things weren't looking good for them. That is, until one of the kids used his fishing rod to get the keys and free themselves. Meanwhile, Casey and Raphael were rescued by the same person who helped the turtles against Bloodsucker. His name was Abennak, and he was the last surviving member of the Algonquin Nation, who had lived in New England for centuries. 400 years ago, the river was their home, and the underground caves were a holy place where they would honor their dead. That is, until Colonel Booter arrived, bringing liquor, guns, and a personal army to do his bidding. He started using the river for power and the sacred grounds for factories. Being the last of his people, Abennak was haunted by his ancestors in his sleep, telling him to find his destiny with the help of some warrior turtles. But he had more pressing matters to deal with in his waking hours. After the Water Quality Act of 1965 was passed, all industrial waste that couldn't be dumped into the Connecticut River started being dumped into the underground lake instead. Feeling bad about this situation, the turtles and Casey helped Abennak stop the pollution by clogging the waste pipeline. On the surface, Manigan and Booter were discussing the recent sighting. They worried that the feds were going to find out about the illegal dumping, so they decided to put an end to all eyewitnesses, including Abennak, who they thought was a ghost. A fight took place. Booter tried to escape, but was surprised and killed by Bloodsucker, ending his reign over the town. In the aftermath, the Environmental Protection Agency arrived to get the situation under control. Having finally stopped the damage to the underground lake, Abennak passed the torch of keeping the place clean to the 3 kids and joined April, Casey, and the turtles on their journey upriver. Abennak knew an ancient spirit at the source of the Connecticut River who was powerful enough to turn Raphael back to normal. But after a car breakdown, the turtles and Abennak continued their journey by canoe. At the end of their travels, they arrived at a hidden lake, the real source of the river, and there they found the Old Man River. This old man explained that in the time of the dinosaurs, a highly technological civilization of learning rose and died very quickly, victims of their own technological discoveries. The few survivors of that extinction forswore all technology but were still very hungry for knowledge. That was when they unlocked the Earth's deepest secrets. They discovered that the rivers of the world were conduits of planetary energy, and by tapping into these power lines, they accelerated their learning until they transcended the flesh and merged completely with the rivers. Since then, every river in the world has been haunted by one of these old men, still hungry for knowledge. It didn't take long for the old man to reveal that everything that had been happening to Raphael was his doing. His curiosity started when Raphael wondered what their lives would have been had they not mutated, so the old man decided to do that experiment. According to him, Raphael was happier now, and all of them would probably be happier the way nature intended them to be. The turtles resisted, but the old man had control over all the creatures in his river, and his psychic attack reached Splinter, who was meditating in Northampton. Bloodsucker was also his creation, and after realizing the turtles weren't going to play by his rules, he allowed the humanoid leech to suck them dry. He was interested in their mutagenic blood, but he could later study it from Bloodsucker's body. Raphael, however, wasn't as happy as the old man suspected, and started biting the old man and later Bloodsucker. Abenak's admiration for the old man collapsed after seeing how he was as small-minded and greedy as all the others who had used the river for their own ends. Abenak attacked the old man, which loosened his psychic trap, freeing Splinter to create a psychic attack, channeled by the Connecticut River, back at the old man, and cutting him from the free-flowing atoms he depended on to keep his many million-year-old body alive. In a desperate move, the old man tried to save himself with rejuvenation. But the process went too fast, and he was now devolving into a baby. He cried for help to Abenak, who also possessed the power to connect with the river, but Abenak let him revert to an embryo. Bite after bite, Raphael reverted back to mutant, and Bloodsucker back into a leech. Abenak stayed there as the new Old Man River, but he helped the turtles return to Northampton. April and Casey, who were starting to develop a romantic relationship, witnessed the brothers surfing on top of fish on their way back home. Back with Splinter, the turtles resumed their training, perhaps with newfound maturity. As for the embryo, it was caught in the current and eventually swallowed by the leech. So, what is the River Trilogy all about? Well, its central theme seems to be the exploitation of nature and power, making a strong connection to the consequences of colonization and industrial exploitation. Colonization was the reason Abenak became the last of his people, and those same colonizers profaned sacred lands and rivers that in the end shouldn't have belonged to anyone. As a result of this industrialization and greed, the river became a victim of pollution, both on the surface and in the underground caves, Abenak's people's sacred ground. Another connection to this industrial greed and exploitation lies in the existence of Bloodsucker. This being drained life from others, and he wanted to continue doing so until the planet became his private preserve. Like colonizers, Bloodsucker treated the land and its inhabitants as resources to be exploited. Bloodsucker didn't just drain life. He grew stronger every time he consumed others' life forces, much like those industrial companies exploiting nature. This exploitation eventually reversed when Raphael ate back what belonged to him, sending a strong message about reclaiming natural resources from greedy industrialists. In the end, Bloodsucker lost what didn't belong to him and returned to being a small leech. This resolution mirrored the fate of the old man, who by trying to control natural forces without respecting them, ended up regressing back to an embryo. Without access to those resources, he became weak enough to be eaten by the very creature he thought he could control. It's also worth noting how Abenak's views of the river drove the whole story. According to his people, the river belonged to everyone. But the story makes an important point. This doesn't mean the river should be left alone. No, the story tells us that we all must ensure the river stays clean and accessible. This is why Abenak became the new old man, and the kids in Booter Falls took over from him to protect the river and the underground lake. The old man himself became one with the river millions of years ago, but the river was already there. His ancient civilization died through the overuse of technology. But in their greed for knowledge and power, like leeches, they tried to control the powers of the planet's rivers, deciding over the lives of its creatures, like Raphael. Speaking of Raph, he and his brothers went through an emotional journey of growing up. At the beginning of the story, the turtles were immature, with Raph in particular unable to focus on nature. After Raph's decline, his brothers realized that their immaturity may have caused their problems, and they embarked on a journey to correct their wrongs. If you think about it, the journey the turtles took in this story mirrors what humanity has been trying to do for decades, taking responsibility for the damage it has done to nature. And while the turtles were able to correct their mistakes in this story, the passing of the torch between the old man, Abenak, and the kids suggests that protecting nature will always be a part of living on this planet, generation after generation. Since the River Trilogy was published during the Guest era, its place in the canon has been put in doubt. However, since a later story, Sons of the Silent Age, was part of the canon and referenced this story, it can be assumed that both stories are canon. In fact, when he was asked 9 years ago, Peter Laird admitted that nothing in that story contradicted the Mirage continuity. So, if this story fits well in the universe, why has it been out of print since 1991? Well, it all comes back to the stressful times of Turtlemania. Any artist that came to Mirage to tell a story with the Turtles retained story and character rights and received royalties in the event of adaptations and reprints. But this came with incredible admin work overhead. The Guest era artists in particular worked on an informal agreement, and every time those issues were reprinted, all the profits had to be divvied up with every creator involved. Dealing with all kinds of lawsuits from the outside world, the situation with the Guest artists was a time bomb in the eyes of the Mirage lawyers. So they advised Kevin and Peter to change those agreements into retroactive work for hire. This was terrible news. The whole point of going to an independent publisher like Mirage was escaping the work for hire system. By exploiting this type of contract, publishers like Marvel and DC accumulated whole universes of characters over the years, usually with no royalties to the creators of those characters. Rick already had enough bad experiences in his life, first and second hand, to understand that this wasn't a good contract for him at the time. He refused to sign it, and that's why his stories were never reprinted again. To be fair, other artists who signed contracts retained royalties from characters created for the franchise until the sale of Turtles to Viacom, when most contracts were bought out. In the new regime, the entire catalog belonged to Paramount, but since Rick never signed the contract, his stories and characters remained in legal limbo ever since. With this and other stories in similar situations off limits, any attempts at collecting the whole volume have been unsuccessful. And unlike stories previously published by Vertigo, Tundra, and even Fantagraphics, because this trilogy had the Turtles in it, it cannot be reprinted by any other publisher. While Bloodsucker became off limits, it is worth mentioning that even when it was legal to use him, he immediately received a copycat for the Archie comics and the toy line. A character named Worm, who was a mutated planarium worm with similar powers. Except for the 2012 version of the character, which was just another take on Mr. Mixyezpitlik. Speaking of the 2012 series, that show's creator, Ciro Nieli, has confirmed in the past that the character known as the Creep was a stand-in for Bloodsucker, a story I will cover some other time. So, will the story ever get reprinted? Well, a similar situation happened before, during the Mirage years when Dave Sim prevented them from reprinting their crossover with Cerebus. But Dave eventually agreed, and the issue has been collected since then. Rick Veitch was open to negotiations. Paramount contacted him about a buyout of his rights, but then they changed their minds, saying that publication plans had changed. I feel like it's just a matter of time until an agreement happens. Until then, you will have to find the only collected edition with the story, or hunt down the single issues. Would you like to see this story reprinted? What are your thoughts on this trilogy, and Splinter's theory about the ooze? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you in the sewers.